decades, Morton Blackwell, the president of the Leadership Institute, one of the great conservative organizations in this country. How are you, sir?
I'm fine, Mark. How are you?
I'm very, very well. Now, you are an expert well, let's start this way. What was the first Republican convention you attended?
The first national convention I attended, I was Barry Goldwater's youngest elected delegate at the 1964 convention in San Francisco.
And how old were you?
I was 24.
24. Now, you've been really to almost every Republican convention since, haven't you?
I've been to all of them since, and I've been either a delegate or an alternate to, I think, all but one since then. In 1972, I had just moved from Louisiana to Virginia, but I went to the convention and helped fight off efforts by Jacob Javits and Chuck Percy to McGovernize the Republican Party rules.
This never ends, does it, Morton?
No.
Now, something happened in 2012 with a particular rule. Something may happen in 2016. Would you like to explain this to the audience, please?
Well, it had been the universal practice of the prospective nominee, that is, the person who went into the convention with enough delegates to win, to lay hands off the Convention Rules Committee and let the two delegates from each state hash out on the basis of fairness and on what's in the long-term interest of the party what the rules should be that should govern the next 4 years. Mitt Romney broke that long precedent and sent his point man into the Convention Rules Committee with a folder full of amendments which the Romney campaign insisted be passed, and they were passed, and they by and large centralized power in the party, but there were specific things that related to the conduct of the nomination process at the convention. First thing that they did was to raise the threshold that a candidate had to have in order to have his name placed in nomination. At the time the convention began, a candidate had to have the personal support of a plurality of the delegates of at least 5 states. And they were afraid that Ron Paul might be able to demonstrate a plurality of 5 states, and they didn't want his name placed in nomination, so they raised the threshold from a plurality of 5 states to a majority of 8 states, which Ron Paul had no chance of doing. So that was the first thing that they did. The other thing that they did, which was enormously aggravating, was they passed a rule that votes wouldn't count for a candidate unless that candidate had reached the threshold of support from the majority of the delegates of 8 states. It wasn't going to affect the outcome, but what they said was only candidates that met the threshold could have votes counted for them in the final tally, and that meant that in 2012, the only votes which counted were those that were cast for Mitt Romney, and other candidates who had earned delegate votes didn't have their votes even counted.
Now, I remember when this happened, you came on the program and you warned the American people. Do you remember that?
I remember it well. That was my first time on your program.
And you walked off the floor, basically, and you called the program and you filled us in on what was going on. So explain to the audience how that will affect the upcoming, or potentially upcoming, Republican convention.
Well, these rules were put in by the establishment, and I made very strong efforts not long after the convention in Tampa in 2012, and again in January of this year, to, among other things, do away with this disenfranchisement of the people who had been duly elected and were voting in accordance with their state party rules. And the first time I did it in the RNC Standing Committee on Rules, I campaigned hard. I made my proposal, and I got the support of 25 states. Each state and territory has one vote on the Standing Committee on Rules, and I got 25 states to vote with me. The other states and the territories in D.C. voted against it, so it failed. Well, in January, I made another run at it, and this time a shotgun thing was not appropriate, so I did a rifle shot and simply attempted to establish that votes cast by credentialed delegates would be counted in the final tally, whether or not they had reached the threshold of a majority of 8 states. And that was a very curious experience, because when I moved it, I got support from people that I had never experienced support from before. The National Committeeman of Massachusetts, who was in charge of the Tampa Convention for Mitt Romney, said that this was the first time he was ever going to vote for a proposal that I made, and the general counsel of the party, John Ryder, the National Committeeman of Tennessee, spoke in favor of it and said it was very reasonable. It wasn't right for the...
Well, let me, before we run out, let's cut to the chase here. Did it pass?
It passed, and then they moved to reconsider it, and then the general counsel moved to amend what had passed and gutted it, took out the right of credentialed delegates to have their votes.
So what is the rule that affects 2016? Let's say we go to this convention and Trump doesn't have a majority and Cruz doesn't have a majority, and how does the establishment benefit from this?
Well, the rules say that no votes can be counted for anybody who doesn't meet the 8-state threshold.
And the 8-state threshold means you have to have a majority of the delegates in each of these 8 states.
That's correct. And if you don't, then no votes cast for you can count. Well, the establishment put in the rules. They defended the rules twice against strong efforts to change them, because I think they still believed in January that somehow these rules were going to facilitate the nomination of an establishment candidate. But that was in January, before any caucuses or primaries had been held. Now, we're more than halfway through the state caucuses and primaries, and the establishment's rules would result in no votes being counted unless they were counted for Ted Cruz or Donald Trump. And so they're desperate, they're panicked now, trying to figure out some way to change the rules that would allow, in a deadlock convention, for the nomination of an establishment candidate rather than Cruz or Trump.
So they want to reverse course in a period of months, because what they don't want now is the threshold they set in 2012 at Romney's direction to try and stop Ron Paul or anybody challenging the establishment, a majority of the delegates in 8 states, because Kasich isn't going to get it, and no establishment candidate has it, correct?
That's right, and I think the plan now is that they're going to calculate what's the minimum number of states that Kasich would be assured to have a majority of the delegates, and they're going to want to reduce the threshold to that number of states. And that would enable, in a deadlock convention, some possibility of a non-establishment candidate being nominated, even though the overwhelming majority of the votes that were cast in these primaries were for non-establishment candidates.
Well, this Ben Ginsburg announced, I read it the other day, though, that rule only applied to 2012. Now, that is about as outrageous as it gets, isn't it, Morton? He said the rule only applied to 2012, the rule on the 8 states majority. The 8 states where you're required to have a majority of delegates in 8 states as opposed to a plurality in fewer states, the establishment set the rule in 2012 against the conservatives and Tea Party, and now it's a rule they're concerned about because that means they're going to have more difficulty fielding a candidate against either a Trump or a Cruz. Am I correct in this?
Absolutely, Mark. And the upshot of it is this. There are now, I believe, only 2 ways that the rules for the nomination process of the convention can be changed. One would be a consensus of all the major players, which I take to be Ted Cruz, Donald Trump, and Reince Priebus, chairman of the RNC, or they could be changed as a result of a ferocious rules battle in Cleveland that could split the Republican Party. Imagine what Cruz and Trump are going to say about a change in the rules towards the very end of the game.
Now, this rules committee, can they try and change it now or in the next few weeks before we get to the convention?
Yes, they could change it at the Standing Committee on Rules, which meets in Hollywood, Florida, at the end of April. They could change it to the Standing Committee on Rules in Cleveland, and then they could change it to the RNC, and then they could change it at the Convention Rules Committee. And if they try it at the Convention Rules Committee, there's likely to be a minority report and a floor battle fought out at the floor of the convention, which we haven't had in many years. The last floor battle over the rules was 1976.
Who controls this committee?
The Convention Rules Committee is composed of a man and a woman elected by the delegations of each state.
So right now, is this a more of establishment leaning or more outsider leaning?
Well, the Standing Committee on Rules and the RNC, the chairman of the Republican National Committee, has absolute control of. It's unheard of the national chairman not getting what he wants out of either of those two committees. The chairman generally has a supermajority of the membership of the RNC. I mean, it's possible that a chairman of the Republican National Committee could get the Republican National Committee to declare that a turnip is an avocado.
But it's an ominous sign, isn't it, when the lawyer who was involved in orchestrating all this for Romney and the establishment, that would be Ben Ginsburg, announces the other day that, this rule only applied to 2012, which, by the way, wouldn't even make any sense.
Well, the rule is still in effect. It's part of the temporary rules of the convention, and it will be in effect unless it is amended. It can be amended, but it exists, and it will be in effect unless it's changed.
But that sounds like what their argument's going to be. That only applied to 2012, not 2016, and we know that's bogus.
Right.
Okay, so I think we are going to have a fight, because there really is no other way to have a third or fourth candidate on any of the ballots challenging either Trump or Cruz, is there?
Not as the rules currently exist, which the establishment put in and prevented it being amended twice.
Yeah, it's funny. You mentioned this, and I brought this up a couple of weeks ago, and then there was a news report saying, no, it only applied to 2012. I said, boy, that's odd. And you're pointing out, no, that is odd, and it's wrong, because unless they amend it, it applies right now.
Correct.
Morton Blackwell, thank you for your sage input. We appreciate your patriotism all these decades, and your friendship in my case, too.
You're a good man, Mark Levin.
As are you, Morton. God bless you. So I was right about this Rule 40. And despite the slip-and-fall lawyer Ben Ginsburg, who in my humble opinion is bought and paid for by the establishment, just keeps showing up, and helped orchestrate this not-so-slick maneuver at the 2012 convention. And as you heard from Morton Blackwell, the RNC types fought this all the way into January, and now they would like to change the rule if they could. Just to remind you, the rule is that you need to have gotten a majority of the delegates in 8 states in order to have your name placed on a ballot for a vote. Well, Kasich isn't going to win under those circumstances. That is, he's not even going to vote. Trump will. Cruz is likely to. So how do they challenge a Cruz or a Trump? How do they challenge them on a ballot vote if they can't even get their so-called candidate on the ballot? Well, they're going to have to change that rule, aren't they, ladies and gentlemen? That's going to be a fight. There's also going to be a fight with the Trump people if Trump doesn't get a majority of the delegates overall, which has been the case for 160 years since 1856, the first Republican convention. So it sounds like there's a couple of factions here who want rule changes, as long as it advantages them.